on behalf of the Political Science Club and the Department of Political Science, I would like to welcome here tonight. First, I do want to thank the people who were pivotal in arranging the events this evening, Mr. Sid Gates with the Progressive Religious Coalition, as well as Ms. Laura Nichols and the Department of Political Science, as well as the Office of Student Activities.
My name is Sid Gates, and I welcome you on behalf of our Augusta's Progressive Religious Coalition. If I could take just a moment of privilege, Augusta State lost a student this week who was a dear friend of mine. I knew Joe Ricketson for about 30 years. He lost his second battle with cancer this week. This is our 5th program under the series of addressing today's issues for a better tomorrow. It's important for us to be aware of facts and to be aware of what's happening in this country, in our government, international affairs. This is what a democracy is about. It's good for you to be here tonight. We thank you for being here tonight. I want to close my opening comments, if I can, with a reading from Howard Zinn's book. Howard Zinn, if you remember the film Good Will Hunting, he was the one appealed to by Matt Damon's character when he said, have you read a real history book like the one by Howard Zinn, his People's History of the United States? His book is entitled A Power Governments Cannot Suppress, and the chapter is entitled The Double Horror of 9/11. This may frame us somewhat tonight. Before I introduce our moderator, let us listen to these words from Howard Zinn's book. Again, A Power Governments Cannot Suppress. We need to realize that the awful scenes of death and suffering we witnessed on 9/11 have been going on in other parts of the world for a long time. And only now can we begin to know what people have gone through, often as a result of our policies. We need to understand how some of those people would go beyond quiet anger to acts of terrorism. That doesn't by any means justify the terror. Nothing justifies killing innocent people. But we would do well to see what might inspire such violence. And it will not be over until we stop concentrating on punishment and retaliation and think calmly and intelligently about how to address its causes. We need new ways of thinking. Hundreds of billions for a military budget have not given us security. Increased militarization, including sending troops to our border with Mexico, has not given us security. Landmines and a missile shield will not give us security. We need to stop sending our weapons to countries that oppress other people or their own people. We need to decide against war, no matter what reasons are conjured up by the politicians or the media, because war in our time is always indiscriminate, always a war against innocents, a war against children. War is terrorism, magnified hundreds of times. How can we prevent 9/11s? We should take our example not from military and political leaders who shout retaliate in war, but from the doctors, nurses, medical students, firefighters, and police officers who were saving lives in the midst of mayhem, whose first thoughts were not violence, but healing, not vengeance, but compassion.
According to the title of the panel, The Triumph and Tragedy. The major triumph is that no other terrorist attack did happen, that Al-Qaeda was weakened and its leader was killed. However, the price of that triumph was too high. We invaded Afghanistan, have been there for 20 years with no end in sight. There have been thousands of US and NATO allies casualties, as well as thousands of Afghans. More tragic was the invasion of Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11 or represented any threat to US security. Thousands of our military personnel were killed and many more were seriously injured. In addition, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed, many of their professionals fled the country, the infrastructure of the country was destroyed and not yet rebuilt. But more seriously, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was created while there was none there before the invasion. The cost of these two wars was a staggering $3 to $5 trillion, with T, trillion dollars. On the domestic front, there was the encroachment on our civil liberties in the name of security, starting with the Patriot Act, which, among other things, authorized wiretapping and other surveillance methods of US citizens who did not commit any crime. The Gitmo prison and torture that happened there tarnished our reputation as a nation that upholds international law and human rights and served as a recruitment tool for Al-Qaeda. Muslim Americans have suffered the most from the curtailment of civil liberties. They were unfairly blamed and ostracized for the heinous crime of 9/11 simply because its perpetrators happened to be Muslims. That, despite the fact that these militants are an extremely small minority of worldwide Muslims and do not represent the Islamic faith, also despite the fact that American Muslims as individuals and organizations have repeatedly condemned this act and terrorism in general. It is worth noting that many of those killed on 9/11 were Muslims, and that many of the first responders who died while saving others were Muslims. My family personally was affected as well. Our son, who grew up in Augusta, had gone to school with you or your kids, has played on the same football or baseball team. Our son, along with his family, lived and worked a few hundred yards from the Twin Towers. He and his pregnant wife and his two daughters, 5 and 7 years old at that time, were all in the streets that awful morning. Thankfully, we got the happy call late that evening that more than 2,700 other families did not. My family, or my son and his family, were alive and well, but they had to leave their home and move with a friend in Connecticut for a couple of weeks. My son and his family, and thousands more of other Muslims in New York City, like other Americans, had their lives turned upside down by this act. Nevertheless, being a Muslim, some in this country would have me share in the blame for this atrocity. I do not. I don't accept that. This was not an act for Muslims or on behalf of Islam or Muslims. It was an affront to Islam and attack on all humanity. It is really a senseless act of violence that flouted all basic tenets of Islam. Both President Bush and Obama declared that the war on terror is not a war against Islam. Nevertheless, there have been an increase in hate crimes, school bullying, and discrimination directed against Muslims. This virulent and recently the more Islamophobia, as we call it, has manifested itself in vandalism of numerous mosques, irrational opposition to the building of mosques. The anti-Islam movement is effectively destroying a core principle of our nation, that's freedom of religion. The 9/11 attack was evil. The question is how to react to evil as a nation. Should our reaction deepen the wounds or heal them? Will we cling to past patterns without introspection, or will we look closely at ourselves and attempt to reform what is deficient? The latter is the real triumph.
I believe that the enduring tragedies from a spiritual perspective of 9/11 stem from the ongoing learning, reinforcement, and generalization of hatred and intolerance. For just one example, this process may lead from the identification of a handful of Muslims as terrorists to the conclusion that all Muslims are terrorists. To give an example, after 9/11, I gave a number of presentations to different audiences in the New York area. And one group of college students I talked to about my delegations to Afghanistan rather, and I showed a photograph of myself standing next to a Muslim imam, an Afghan imam. When a student saw this photograph, he said, "When I see that man dressed with the turban and the robes, my immediate reaction is, he's a terrorist." When I gave other presentations about Islam and Afghanistan, one of the most frequently asked questions was, why do they hate us? When I was on another peace delegation to Iran, I visited the village of Natanz, which is a village close to the nuclear site. We visited an orphanage of young girls, and they were very shy. At first they didn't want to talk, but eventually we got them to speak, and the first question they asked was, why do you hate us? There isn't time in 5 minutes to tell you so many stories of spiritual triumphs, but I believe there have been many. The first occurred in the days immediately following 9/11 in New York City. In that city, that big, cold, jaded, impersonal city, in the midst of all the grief and tragedy, there was an outpouring of mutual support, kindness, and generosity. If I walked down the street in my religious habit, I would be stopped every few feet by someone who wanted to talk, who wanted to pray, wanted to cry, wanted to tell their stories. There are any number of stories of what people did to help one another and support one another in those days. In the years following 9/11, I believe the spiritual triumphs have been in the development of new relationships, new understanding, and commitment to a peaceful future. A year ago, the Muslims in our community here in Augusta initiated what is now the Augusta Interfaith Fellowship. It's a group that meets once a month, and we've already had one public program. I believe this organization would not exist but for 9/11. There have been many civilian projects in Afghanistan that have supported women and children, healthcare, education. When I visited Afghanistan in 2003 and 2004, there was optimism and hope that after 25 years of war, there would be peace and recovery. There are so many stories I could tell you, but I'm just going to tell you one. When I visited a woman's project, I spoke with a widow, and I asked her what craft she was learning. They were teaching baking and sewing and other types of crafts. And this woman pulled herself up to her full height, and she looked at me and she said, "We are just as good as our brothers, and I want to learn everything." I think as part of our questions this evening, we will be hearing the mission statement for the Ground Zero Memorial. So I won't repeat it for you now because that'll take all my time. But there are two words that are omitted from that memorial statement. They are forgiveness and repentance. And I can understand well why these words are omitted. But holding on to anger and desire for revenge is toxic to the soul of individuals and the soul of a nation. It's, as they say, like taking poison and expecting the other person to feel the results. Archbishop Desmond Tutu has written that forgiveness does not exclude hatred and anger. These emotions are all part of being human. And forgiveness does not mean forgetting. But he also wrote this prayer. Can I finish? He wrote this prayer concerning apartheid in South Africa. "Oh God, this happened to us. We pray for those who made it happen. Help us to forgive them and help us so that we, in our turn, will not make others suffer." Thank you.
I wish I could say that our military is not engaged in fruitless wars. I cannot. I wish I could say that 50 million children are getting the best education in the world. I cannot. I wish I could say that the corporate world is not involved in controlling Congress. I cannot. I wish I could say that 14 million jobs are being created by corporations in this country, instead of outsourcing these jobs to China and India. I wish I could say that the Congress is working for the good of the country, instead of damaging the social infrastructure of Social Security and Medicare. I cannot. I wish I could say that the middle class is growing, and that financial gain is helping all groups instead of the wealthiest ones. I cannot. The election of a black president seemed to have signaled that racial hatred had diminished in our country. The celebration of this new morality didn't last long, and unfortunately, disrespect for the president has increased. For example, on a political sense, not one day, I repeat, not one day goes by that our newspaper and their cartoonists and their editorial supporters not only disagree with him, but heap disdain on President Obama. Respecting our president goes along with respecting the United States. Many state legislators, and particularly Georgia, have picked on education to balance the state budget. Millions of dollars have been taken away from our county schools. Hope scholarships have been reduced, and the pressures of No Child Left Behind have caused shameful behavior by some teachers. Under these conditions, how can our children compete with other children in other countries? They can't, especially in science and math, crucial subjects for global jobs. People of Georgia deserve proper representation. Today, we find that the party in power is trying by redistricting to make itself white and the minority party all black. This is retrogressive and not a true representation of the minority party. What kind of morality is that? Have we overcome the disaster of 9/11? I give credit to both administrations that have protected us against further attacks. It is part of our history that this country rises to fight back and win. It is not part of our history that torture becomes a useful tool to claim victory. It is also not part of our history that we invade countries to preempt suspected weapons of mass destruction that were never found. It is also not part of our history that we send our Secretary of State to the United Nations to lie. We must realize that children 10 years old or younger know nothing about peace, that the video games they play with shooting and death are real to them because of what they see on television news. What kind of generation will they become? If I have painted too bleak a picture, I'd be glad to hear better news. Right now, I'm doubtful whether 9/11 has made us grow in stature. Hopefully, the future will bring better things. Thank you.
That morning of 9/11, it's indelibly planted in my mind and in my heart and in my spirit. Much like the day I heard when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. That kind of moment that you never forget. And so, with that, I'd like to bring a perspective maybe a little different than others, and that of the Civil Rights Movement and Dr. Martin Luther King in dealing with opposition and terrorism locally. Dr. King believed that in all things there's a blessing and a lesson, which means that even in the most horrific and destructive times, there is something to be learned. He was also a proponent of love and unconditional love. In fact, he says, and I quote, that returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to night already void of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to interview Rosa Parks. And I asked the question of her, why did we boycott the bus? And I thought it was a rhetorical question, that it was because we wanted to bankrupt them. And she said, oh no, that's not why. And then I asked the question, then why? She says the first step in any liberation process is that the oppressed must first withdraw its participation from its own degradation. You see, if America is to truly be this beacon, this example, then we cannot imitate or emulate our opposition. When we do things that are similar to what has been done to us, then we merely validate their approach to opposition. And so, Dr. King, I believe, is correct, that we must return violence with love, unconditional love. Now, during this time after 9/11, the world became America. All over the world, there were sympathy for America. But based upon America's response to its tragedy, much of the support that was garnered during that period was lost. I was told that life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you react to it. And I believe that our reaction to what we have experienced must be that of an example to what we'd like to see the world to be.
This week in the Financial Times, there was an op-ed piece by the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at Singapore National, a man whom I respect greatly by the name of Dr. Kishore Mahbubani. And he is an avid watcher of international politics, and he had a very insightful comment, really spanning what has been taking place this year. And his, to paraphrase, and I'm sure I'm doing this badly, Dr. Mahbubani made the point that he said, we live in a time period where dictatorships are failing and democracies are falling apart. And I thought that was very well put. And it kind of summarizes the 10 years since 9/11. We've heard the panelists, and you're getting a real sense of some of the issues at the heart of politics in this country, both domestic and foreign. 9/11 has raised a lot of questions. And as a professor here on campus, I think the bigger concern that most of us as academics have about discussing 9/11 is that for a lot of our students, they get younger, we get older. So we remember where we were at 9/11. But for many of them, and especially, I think I still have students in classes who maybe remember 9/11 as a personal kind of thing, but very soon we will be getting students in our classes who really have no recollection of 9/11 as a real event. It's more of a historic event for many of them. It's something that they've seen on TV, in documentary clips, and they've heard their parents talk about it, but we're soon going to be in the process of educating these students about 9/11. So I think I want to kind of spend a few minutes just talking about the theme of continuity and change, because as we look at 9/11, I think as an academic, for me it's important to remember that 9/11 didn't just happen. It was the consequence of a long history, and the people who boarded those planes for a very specific set of reasons, and the United States was targeted. And the targeting was a consequence of failing policies in Southwest Asia. And those policies, there's libraries that can be filled with books written about this subject, but the truth is, it was a consequence of terrible foreign policies by the United States. And this is not the first time in human history that big powers have done what they do, and small countries have paid the price. And this won't be the last time either. And 9/11 was a consequence of policies of that kind. So as we educate young people coming into our classrooms, I, for one, would be focusing on themes of continuity and change, because I think there are lots and lots of similarities that you can see with 9/11. There have been other episodes like this in human history with big powers, and the United States is no exception. It is another big power that has done a great deal of damage to a lot of countries, and there's a lot of anger. There was a graph in the Washington Post this week showing the dramatic drops in popularity of the United States in the 11 years since 2000. This was a graph put out by the Pew Charitable Trust, and it shows the consequences of 9/11 in terms of perceptions of the United States worldwide, especially in Islamic countries. And in particular, the two countries where the US is facing a great deal of problems in perceptions is two major players for the United States in foreign policy, Turkey and Pakistan. And that is bad news for the United States going into the future. I want to, in 1 minute or less, just this is something that my students and I have been talking about, and I think I should end with a quote from Hans Morgenthau, who, talking about the Vietnam War, came up with 5 factors of what he called irrational politics. And let me just summarize them for you. His first factor was the imposition upon the empirical world of a simplistic picture of the world derived from what he called folklore or ideological assumptions. The second was a refusal to correct this picture of the world in light of experience. The third was the persistence of policies derived from this misperception and the use of intelligence for the purpose not of adapting policies to reality, but of reinterpreting reality to fit the policy. And the fourth was egotism of the policymakers, which widens the gap between perception and reality. And the last was the urge to close the gap by action, any kind of action, to create the illusion of mastery over a recalcitrant reality. And I thought that just about sums it up.
When you talk about the cost of war, then you have to talk about the cost of freedom. It's just like the scale of justice. You want it to be balanced. Yes, there is a cost to war. Yes, there is a cost to freedom. And war may be the price we have to pay for that freedom. Now, there are 2 things, and as Laurie has already said, working with the Wounded Warrior Program, we look at these young men and women coming back from Afghanistan. But remember when our fathers came back from the war in Korea, we had Vietnam, we had World War II. The technology wasn't there. They came back in body bags. These people are coming back. They're coming back alive. They do have problems, but we don't have any more suicide today than we had with the returning veterans from Vietnam. And we have to look at, do you want to fight on our soil? Do you want to fight over there? And again, how do you weigh the price of freedom? How much are you willing to pay for that freedom? And for my grandchildren, I'll pay it.
Selecting a scapegoat has gone back in this country to the 1920s, when immigrants were given the wrong treatment. And the idea of some congressman, especially the chairman of a committee, is to raise his level of interest by the people so he gets reelected. I don't want to get into whether a Republican should have done this or a Democrat should have done this, but it's old hat. And I think you bring up a very good point. In the McCarthy era, it was the so-called communists. And people, academic people, lost their jobs right and left because they were considered pinkos. So I think it's up to all of us to understand what's going on and not react to it in a very positive fashion.
Yeah, I just want to say this is one of the dangers of democracy, is that you have elected representatives and they need to get elected, and that means they've got to get your vote, and they pander to the vote. And to back up Dr. Greenbaum, that's basically what you're seeing. We live in quote unquote dangerous times, and you can make a lot of political mileage if you can get yourself a hearing and get yourself a room and get a bunch of people together. And so there's a lot of political mileage that can be made, and it's not just in this country, it happens in many countries, and it happens in democracies, unfortunately. We're more prone to those kinds of things. It's not a pleasant thought that a community is going to get scapegoated, but I think we open ourselves up to those opportunities. But the other thing about a democracy is you can't shut that process down except in a legal way. And I think we as voters have a responsibility not to fall into that trap.
There is an agenda going on, and who is benefiting from it? And as far as Dr. Sula saying, well, this is part of life, part of being a Democrat, I have been to Hiroshima, and I have not heard one word of hate from those people who were standing there with garlands, and they were bereaved people as well as school children. They were not being taught to hate the Americans who destroyed their family and their entire city.
I think you touched on something very important, and that is media. And media is immediate today. And if someone makes a statement, by the time it's on the computers, AOL, Google, things like that, if they take a little blurb out of the entire conversation, out of the entire paragraph, and they just keep pulling that out, saying, this is what so-and-so said, this is what so-and-so said, out of context. And I think the media has a lot to do with what's going on.
They spew hate, pure, unadulterated hate, every day, all day. And you can get talk radio 24 hours. Now, the media was never that poisonous when the Republicans were in the White House. No. Little criticisms here and there. But those people, you have mass amnesia. Those people wrecked the country. The man in there now has tried his best to repair it. And you say, no, no, no. They've already said no to his speech tonight. Republicans are going to vote against whatever he says and proposes. That is the job you're talking about. You had only one Republican governor to turn back stimulus money. And that was the one in Florida who turned down money for mass transit, rapid rail. The rest of them took every penny of it. But then they turn around and they want to criticize because they don't want you to know what they're taking back here. So I
have to respond with not every governor was Republican now. The Democrats didn't get as much. So nobody
didn't turn it down, but the Republicans accepted it with the exception of one Florida.
both the Republicans and the Democrats.